Chapter 5, Part G of Greener Than You Think. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greener Than You Think by Ward Moore. Chapter 5, Part G. I find myself, in retrospect, involuntarily telescoping the time of events. Looking backward, years become days, and months minutes. At the time I saw the first reproductions of the grass in London, the thing itself was continents away, busy absorbing the fringes of Asia. But its heralds and victims went before it, changing the life of man as it had itself changed the face of the world. The breakdown of civilization beyond the Channel was almost complete. Only Consolidated Pemmican and the world government still maintained communication facilities. And with the blocking of the normal ways of commerce, the world government found it difficult to spread either news or decrees to the general public. The most fantastic and contradictory ideas about the grass were held by the masses. When the grass was in the Deccan, and still well below the Yangtze, the Athenians were thrown into panic by the rumor it had appeared in Salonika. At the same time, there was wild rejoicing in the streets of Marseille, based on the belief large stretches of North America had become miraculously free. The cult of the grass idolaters flourished despite the strictest interdictions, and great mass meetings were frequently held, during which the worshippers turned their faces toward the southeast and prayed fervently for speedy immolation. It was quite useless for the world government to attempt to spread the actual facts. The earlier censorship, together with a public temper that preferred to believe the extremes of good or bad rather than the truth of gradual yet relentless approach, made people heedless of broadcasts, rarely received even by state-operated public address systems, or of handbills which even the still literate could not bother to decipher. The idealization of the Socialist Union, once the Soviet Union, which had risen and fallen through the years, was quickened among those not enamored of the grass. There must be some intrinsic virtue in this land, which had not only been immune to inoculation by the metamorphizer, but kept the encroaching weed from invading its borders in spite of its long-continued proximity across Bering Strait and the Aleutians. The grass had jumped gaps thousands of ocean miles, and yet it had not bridged that narrow strip of water. It would have been a shock to these people had they known, as I knew, and as the world government had vainly tried to tell them, what Moscow had recently and reluctantly admitted. The grass had long since crossed into Siberia, and was now working its will from Kamchatka to the Lena River. The people of Japan, caught between the jaws of a closing vice, responded in a manner peculiar to themselves. The Christians, now forming a majority, declared the grass a punishment for the sins of the world, and hoped, by their steadfastness in the face of certain death, to earn a national martyr's crown, and thus perhaps redeem those still benighted. The Shintoists, on the other hand, agreed the grass was a punishment, but for a different crime. Had the doctrine of the 8 corners of the world never been abandoned, the Japanese would never have permitted the grass to overwhelm the Yameta race. The new emperor's reign name, Saiji, they argued, ought not to mean rule by the people, as it was usually interpreted, but rule of the people, and they called for an immediate Saiji restoration, under which the subjects of the Mikado would welcome death on the battlefield in a manner compatible with Bushido, thus redeeming previous aberrations for which they were now being chastised. Both parties agreed that under no circumstances would any Japanese demean himself by leaving Nippon, and the world was therefore spared an additional influx from these islands. But the Japanese were the only ones who refused to join the westward stampede, plunging the world daily deeper into barbarism. We in England had cause to congratulate ourselves on our unique position. The Channel might have been 1,000 miles wide instead of 20. The turmoil of the continent and of Africa was but dimly reflected. There was still a skeletal vestige of trade. The dole kept the lazy from starvation. Railways still functioned on greatly reduced schedules, and the wireless continued to operate from "Good morning, everybody, this is London" to the last strains of "God Save the Queen." Although I was constantly rasped by inactivity and by the slowness of the research workers to find a weapon against the grass, I was happy to be able to wait out this terrible period in so ameliorative a spot. True, our depots in the Arabian and Sahara deserts were unthreatened by either the grass or the horde, but I should have found it uncomfortable indeed to have lived in either place. In Hampshire or London, I felt myself the center of what was left of the world, ready to jump into action the moment the great discovery was finally made and the grass began to recede. Preblesham, my right hand, flew weekly to Africa and Asia Minor, weeding out those workers who threatened to become useless to us because of their reaction to the isolated and monotonous conditions at the depots, keeping the heavily armed guards about our closed continental properties alert and seeing our curtailed activities in Great Britain were judiciously profitable. This period of quiescence suited his talents perfectly, for it required of him little imagination, but great industry and force. I had noticed for some time a slight air of preoccupation and constraint in his demeanor during his reports to me, but I put it down to his engrossment with our affairs, and resolved to make him take an extended vacation as soon as he could be spared, never dreaming of disloyalty from him. I was shocked then, and deeply wounded when at the close of one of our conferences he announced, "Mr. Wiener, I'm leaving you." I begged him to tell me what was wrong, what had caused him to come to this decision. I knew I said that he was overworked, and offered him the badly needed vacation. He shook his head. "It ain't that. Overwork? I don't believe there is such a thing. At least I've never suffered from it. No, Mr. Wiener, my trouble is something no amount of vacations can help, because I can't get away from a voice." Voice, Tony? Hallucinations were certainly a sign of overwork. I began mentally recalling names of prominent psychiatrists. "A voice within," he repeated firmly. "I am a sinful man, a miserable backslider. Maybe Brother Paul was not treading a true path. I doubt if he was, or I would not have been led aside from following him so easily. But when I was doing his work, I was at least trying to do the will of God, and not the will of another man no better, spiritually, you understand, Mr. Wiener, spiritually, than myself. But now his voice has sought me out again, and I must once more take up the cross. I feel a call to go on a mission to the poor heathens, and urge on them submission to their father's rod." "Among those savages across the Channel? They will tear you limb from limb." "Christ will make me whole again." "Tony, you are not yourself. You're upset." "I am not myself, Mr. Wiener. I have become as a little child again, and do my father's bidding. I am upset, yes, turned upside down and inside out by a force, not content to leave men in wrong attitudes or sinful states. But upset, I stand upright and go about my father's business. God bless you, Mr. Wiener." Miss Frances and Preblesham, at opposite ends of the intellectual scale, both maundering on about doing the will of God, and General Thario talking about marks on foreheads. What sort of feeble-minded, retrogressive world was I living in? All the outworn superstitions of religion taking hold of people and intruding themselves into otherwise normal conversation. A wave of madness akin to the plague of the grass must be sweeping over the earth, was my conclusion. If General Thario's desertion had thrown an extra weight on my shoulders, Preblesham's burdened me with all the petty details of routine. It was now I who had to inspect our depots periodically and make constant trips into the dangerous regions across the Channel to see that the shut-down plants were being properly cared for. I resented bitterly the trick of fate preventing me from finding for any length of time subordinates to whom I could delegate authority. Nor even on whom I could rely. What were Miss Frances and her well-paid staff doing all this time?